Hello, everyone, and welcome to Biollywood. In this series, we talk about biological threats and pop culture media that they appear in. I'm J.T. O'Brien, Research Principal at the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense, and I'm here with the Commission's Executive Director, Dr. Asha M. George, and the Commission's Policy Principal, Rob Bradley. Today, we'll be talking about an episode from The West Wing. We're going to discuss Season 5, Episode 20 of the series, which has a bioterrorism component. The title of this episode is No Exit. The West Wing was developed by Aaron Sorkin before his departure in Season 5, when executive producer John Wells took over as showrunner. The episode aired in April of 2004 and was written by Carol Flint, Mark Goffman, and Deborah Kahn, and was directed by Julie Hebert. So the premise of this episode is after a black tie dinner, the president and his staff are locked down inside the White House when a foreign substance is detected inside. And this forces an odd coupling of people who are forced to occupy small rooms where they share personal reflections. If you have not seen this episode, we would highly recommend you do so before continuing this podcast. The podcast will contain spoilers for No Exit, and this is your final warning.
We will be discussing elements of the series as in a spoilery fashion as it relates to this episode, so we strongly recommend that you watch the series as a whole if you wish to not be spoiled at all.
Yeah, and I would like to add that for the past couple of episodes, it's just been me and JT, but Rob is here not just because he's our policy principal, but because Rob has seen the entire West Wing series 4 times now.
At least.
Yes, so he's our West Wing series guru and expert.
For whatever that's worth.
So yeah, let's jump into this episode. I think one of the things that struck me most from the beginning of the episode was the environmental detection system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's talk about the environmental detection system. Let's do that right now.
I feel like we can't discuss this episode without talking about our commission's longstanding work looking at environmental detection in the biodefense space, particularly as it pertains to the BioWatch program, which I did just look it up, and this episode came out in April of 2004 after the deployment of BioWatch. Mm-hmm. So I can't help but wonder if Sorkin or someone else involved in the production of this either spoke with individuals at the Secret Service with regard to what the White House does for its system, or took inspiration from the public declarations and announcement of a nationwide biodetection system to inform, at least in part, how this episode unfolded.
Yeah, I think too it's worth saying that we had started looking at the BioWatch system, which is environmental biodetection outside, and this is about indoor air and detection. And then we just recently had an indoor air meeting on July 25th. So if people are actually interested in that, they can go listen to that. But I do want to bring up one point from that meeting that Jim Greenwood, former representative from Pennsylvania and one of our commissioners, made. He was asking somebody about outdoor detection and indoor detection, and she tried to slide around the question and said, well, we're just focused on indoor. But he made a really good point that the air from the inside or in the inside is coming from the outside. So if you detected something on the inside, that might be a good way to see what's going on outside as well. So I'm just making the point that what's outside and what's inside and which detectors are where might not be such a big deal. There's not a line between the data you might get from outside and the data you might get from inside.
I do have to make note of the fact that we've done an entire report on environmental biodetection. It's called Saving Sisyphus. JT and I led the development of that report, and we had a really great opportunity to talk to people historically involved in the establishment of the BioWatch program, as well as talking about biodetection technology in the private sector, what the national labs are doing in the space from a research, science technology point of view, but also getting a sense of what else was out there around this time frame, like the Pentagon's own detection system. And I have to admit, looking through that lens and everything, all the work we did there, I can't speak for you, for the two of you, but the first thing that struck me as I watched this episode was this seemed highly unrealistic based on where technology was back in 2004.
Well, at least the air EKG that they had,
air
I was
EKG.
like,
I
wow.
mean, the sorts of terms that were on that monitor. I have environmental monitoring system. They also referred to it as an EHM, an environmental hazard monitor.
Yeah.
They refer to it measuring particulates and spectral irradiances on that system. Now, a particle monitor, obviously, we're very familiar with that, and there is some value there. But it was fascinating watching both the technology that they were essentially using to track something in real time, and having a human being in front of this monitor at all times.
Yeah.
And how it compares to what our policies have been, even with the Pentagon, with regard to tracking potential biological threats in an indoor setting. We have much more trended towards an automatic sort of system that alerts when there's something unusual, not a human being sitting at a screen waiting to see if something's about to happen.
Yeah, I think too. I did look up environmental hazard monitor,
Yeah.
and there is such thing as an EHM. But it's interesting that in all of our research and all of our talking with people, not one person has ever used that acronym.
Yeah.
So I think, it's an interesting thing, and who knows, maybe somebody created the EHM after this episode came out. But one thing I wanted to mention about this that struck me was, okay, putting aside whether it's realistic or unrealistic, that there was a detection system that pictorially displayed the EKG for the air and showed something. Put that aside for a second. What I thought was odd in this episode is while they did lock down the White House, and if you were in, you were in, if you were out, you were out, and that was it. That part was fine. I can imagine them doing that. What I thought, if you're going to go as far as to have this kind of technology and say it's as advanced as it was on this show, then I think it would be like the Pentagon, where they say we're seeing X in this, part of the Pentagon. We are we're not just shutting off, we're shutting everybody inside the Pentagon. We are closing doors to that section. They're probably doing something about the air. They're shunting air in different places. They're keeping air in that one place the way it is. Did they mention that in this episode?
In the episode, they shut off the air in the HVAC system, which is how Mary McCormick's character is able to identify that there's something going on or that it's possibly biological.
But they did it for the whole White House, not
just that one room.
Yeah.
But there was a brief scene where they had someone wearing PPE putting up a tarp to block a doorway in the staff area, but then it's almost like the next scene it's gone. So they pay some lip service to this notion of cordoning off an area as a narrative way to convey to the characters that there's some level of severity to this, that it's not just a drill, right? I think Richard Schiff and Joshua Malina's characters end up seeing that piece and go, okay, this is not just a run-of-the-mill drill. This is not a false alarm. But then by the next scene, I don't think you even see that in the background at that point. And instead, the focus and the attention of taking care of physical space and health falls back to the primary trio of the president and his aides as they're going through their process with the physician and the Secret Service.
So one thing I want to mention, too, before we keep going, and that is the role of the Secret Service. Of course, the Secret Service would be involved. It's a security issue inside the White House. So it doesn't matter what it is, nuclear, biological, chemical, explosive, incendiary, of course it would be involved. But I think that we identified them as part of the biodefense enterprise. They have been investing in biodetectors inside and outside for quite some time, and they've been aware of this threat for quite some time. We recently put something up on our website called B-Spam, and it's for two channels. One is for the executive branch, the other is for the legislative branch, and we do list the Secret Service there. If you go to our website and then click on activities, and then you can go to B-Span executive branch, then click on the Department of Homeland Security, and you can go see what they're up to.
Yeah.
It was our way of trying to help visualize for folks who are responsible for making important policy decisions in this area where the expertise and the responsibility lies both in the executive and legislative branches for national biodefense. And we hope it's a useful tool, not just to those decision makers, but also to the public to better inform their understanding of this space.
Mm-hmm. I will also say about the Secret Service in this episode, at first I was wondering, like, why are they so, like, they're not donning PPE, they're not doing anything. And then I remembered that the Secret Service, their emergency operations center is not inside the White House. It is in a separate area. I think it might even be in the Treasury building, which is right next to the White House. And also I would say that the Secret Service has gotten a whole lot more money since this episode aired. So, at least since this episode aired. So their emergency operations center is spectacular. It is an amazing thing to go in and see. But I just wanted to mention that they were not, they didn't seem to be worried about what they were breathing. And then I remembered that they're not even there in that building.
And it's entirely possible that, that's also just a fact of, actors not wanting to hide their faces when they don't have to, right?
Yeah,
and they're buying PPE if they can afford it. But it could also be that. What I thought was striking about the Secret Service in this episode, and this goes to that spoiler warning at the beginning of this podcast episode, is that this is really the first time that I recall, might be even the only time in the entire series, where they pull back the curtain, and show you what the Secret Service is actively doing to secure the White House. Mm-hmm. Outside the viewpoint of the main actors. It's kind of a rarity, frankly, when you have those scenes in this series that don't have one of the main actors. There's an establishing shot inside what appeared to be some sort of operations center. Mm-hmm. I don't know if it may not have been the emergency operations center that showed that environmental monitor. That's a first, I believe, in the series. They never really talked too much about how the Secret Service secures the White House. This is really a one-off episode where they showed that a little bit more. And there's some implication that hazmat, I don't know, they didn't really talk about where the hazmat or who the hazmat is associated with, but that there's hazmat involved in their response. But every other time the Secret Service is mentioned in the show, it's always in the context of, getting Bartlett out of harm's way following the assassination attempt at the end of season 1. Mark Harmon, who went on to obviously great success with NCIS, starring as a Secret Service agent in, I believe it might have been season 3, where he obviously meets an unfortunate end, but he ends up being part of the story.
And he was assigned to CJ.
He was assigned to CJ, and there's a bit of a romance there.
Yeah.
So they have the Secret Service that they are on the periphery in a protective mode. Butterfield is there kind of as like the safety blanket for the president throughout. And that they're there, but they've never really shown it from their perspective. And this really was, from my perspective, as outside of the Mark Harmon storyline, the first time and perhaps the only time you really get that viewpoint.
Well,
I thought that was fascinating.
I would say, too, that's kind of realistic because the Secret Service is not front and center, in terms of protecting the president, the vice president, and the staff. They are kind of in the background, and we really shouldn't see too much of them.
Yeah.
But, this is nice. I'm glad they do it because it is kind of a kudo to them to show that they are, very active.
Yeah. Well, and that you can't have a conversation about protecting the president from biological threats without talking about the Secret Service and what they do behind the scenes when nobody's looking. And so I thought that was important.
Yeah.
Related to that, I wanted to ask you guys, the term crashing. I don't think I'd heard that before.
I'm familiar with the term. I honestly can't tell you if I picked it up during my life in D.C. or if I just picked it up because I've watched The West Wing so many times over a number of years. But maybe, Asha, you have more familiarity with.
It's not a military term.
Yeah, I think it might have just been lingo that they used for the purposes of the episode. But it had the functional equivalent of saying lockdown, right? I mean, that's essentially, I guess, a way to save themselves a syllable or two. To say that. But I thought that was, I agree, that was interesting. It stood out to me a little bit even as I was hearing it because it's unusual. I was expecting them to say lockdown.
Well, what we should do is we should ask, we have 2 people on the commission that worked in the White House, Governor Ridge and Dr. Raj Punjabi. We can ask them about crashing.
If they're familiar with any of that lingo. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so...
Another thing I wanted to mention about the environmental detection system that I thought was really interesting about this episode, especially since it came out just after BioWatch, was conceived, was they kept complaining about false alarms. They kept complaining about false alarms.
I mean, this
Totally realistic.
Totally realistic.
I got
5 out of 5.
I mean, yeah, I have no notes on that part, obviously. But since you do mention the technology, I know I kind of said at the beginning that it seemed wildly unrealistic to me. Part of it was the timing.
Timing.
I don't know if you guys kept track, but apparently the system picked up the threat within 15 minutes after exposure began. Lockdown occurred 8 minutes post-detection. And the all clear was given at the 43-minute mark. So there's a few things at play here.
Wow.
Well, not to mention the analysis part, right?
Yeah.
They say in this show that they noticed, or that the computer or whatever noticed, an unusual pattern in airborne particles.
Yes.
So he was something was able to compare to something else and say, this is unusual.
Which is like the Pentagon system.
Well, it's a little bit like the Pentagon system, but it's actually more similar to what BD-21 by the Department of Homeland Security was trying to do.
Yeah.
The whole point of what they were trying to do there was utilize particle sensors and other emerging technology, new technology, to create an array of data that an algorithm could parse through, and from that process say, there is an anomalous biological material in the air that warrants further investigation. Now, the problem, as you alluded to before, is the false alarm rate. How do you determine whether or not whatever's in the air is in fact a threat versus just something docile that, or perhaps even a miss by the algorithm itself, and there isn't actually anything in the air that warrants additional investigation. And so when I was watching this episode and I saw that essentially the system is kind of like that, my first thought was they must be doing a false alarm every day based on the technology available at the time. Because if they're crashing, if they're locking down every time there's something anomalous in the air, I mean, they kind of ran through a number of scenarios of what could have triggered that. I think in the episode, it could have been, they applied it, could have been, was perfume perhaps even, or something else. Like and it could have been on the flowers. It could have been, any number of things. I can't imagine how incredibly disruptive it would have been if they were actually locking down every time this system triggered, which kind of gets to a question that we often wrestle with, which is at what is the threshold for determining that you have enough information to take action, to lock a place down for further investigation. BD-21 unfortunately ran up against a bit of a wall there, realizing that they couldn't get the technology to a point where folks in the states and localities would feel comfortable deploying response teams that frequently to crowded areas and potentially shut down major public areas that frequently.
But I would say in this episode, President Bartlett does say, he mentions in conversation with the Secret Service that there have been all these false alarms for anthrax. So they did pick up on anthrax.
They did. They did.
In our culture and in our society, but he's not the only one. There are other staff throughout this episode that talk about false alarms. So maybe they are shutting down every single day for something.
I mean, it seemed like they were frustrated.
They seemed like they were
like, oh, it's another false
alarm. They definitely seemed like they were frustrated, but what I thought was interesting is that the staff themselves seemed surprised at how serious the response was this time versus the other times. And given how rapid it was in locking down and adjudicating within a 43-minute period, frankly, you just don't have enough information, enough confirmatory testing done at that point to assume that they would be doing it any other way, any other time. So that's where the confusion comes for me.
And not just in 2004 when they
exactly.
Today.
Today. 20 years later.
20 years later.
More than 20 years later. If you're locking down the White House 15 minutes after this thing was released and 8 minutes after detection, and you're adjudicating it within a 43-minute, we're talking about an hour has taken place between release and all clear. First of all, I was trying to figure out if PCR testing could even happen that quickly.
I don't think it can.
But setting aside that element, you are not in a spot to be able to make a call 5 minutes into a lockdown. Okay, well, we're not going to take this one seriously. Let's not put up the tarps. Let's not have people with PPE. Every crash would be that way. And so that to see the staff surprised is interesting.
Well, and I think, too, it's not even that the system has picked up on a biological agent.
It just said an
anomaly. It is an unusual pattern in the air. So what constitutes an unusual pattern? Where is the trigger to crash or to shut everything down? How often would that happen? Now, one can assume that if it happened a lot, that you would have that data, and maybe that would inform the threshold, beyond which you would, would shut everything down versus, hey, we've seen this 92 times down here, down low, and that's, it's unusual, but it's not enough to close the entire White House.
Yeah. But it's just, and I guess we can give a pass to the White House, because if any building would shut down,
constantly
at the drop of a pin, it would be the White House to ensure and maintain the safety of the president. But we also would have heard about that happening a lot if that was happening all the time.
Yeah. Well, not if it's normal.
I guess.
But they can't account for a daily hour, even if it only takes an hour.
Mm-hmm.
An hour-long disruption in the president's schedule, that there's no way I feel like the press wouldn't pick up on that in some way. Like, why?
Yeah,
you know what I'm
president's
saying?
The president's schedule today was 2 to 3 p.m. in his daily lockdown.
We have no idea.
But I did think it was interesting that, getting into the threshold question. I think in the White House you can make a solid argument for taking every sort of anomalous detection seriously to that level if you really wanted to. But you're not doing that in any sort of other space outside the White House, even in other federal buildings. It would just be way too disruptive.
I don't even think it happens at the Pentagon.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, the Pentagon system, again, is kind of more automatic, right? It's a three-stage system. It's a three-stage system. The first bit is basically particle detection. And then when that detects a number of particles, it feeds through a vacuum tube to this secondary testing, the Canary technology we previously looked at for saving Sisyphus, which can kind of see if there's a problem there. I think it's a
biological.
I think it's against a larger number of potential pathogens than the current BioWatch program can do. And then if that triggers, the third level is an on-site lab. And
I just have it.
I wouldn't put it past the White House to have an on-site lab. Mm-hmm. But even by those standards, you're not adjudicating a lockdown in an hour.
No.
You have not collected samples, cultured it, conducted PCR testing in an hour.
Yeah, I will say, in terms of the lockdown itself, Senator Daschle, who serves as a commissioner on our commission, was asked by the West Wing Weekly podcast whether this portrayal of the lockdown was accurate. And he said, even for the 28 staff that was exposed to anthrax in his office and sequestered, and the role of the Capitol Police and all of that, he did say that he thought that the portrayal was accurate of the lockdown.
Yes, of the lockdown. I think it made a lot of sense looking at it. It would have been everything I would have recommended. The one piece
there's even use of force.
That was a little surprising to see.
Was that Secret Service that tackled the other guy?
I believe it was implied that that Richard Schiff was tackled to the ground by Secret Service during when he attempted to leave his office.
Well, as it should have been.
But one thing about the lockdown and the procedures that they went through to adjudicate the threat that I thought was interesting, first of all, there seems to be, oftentimes in popular culture, this conflation between chemical and biological threats. And we saw it in play in this episode as well, making the president and his aides take a shower.
A chemical shower.
A chemical shower, just on the off chance that they were exposed. Mm-hmm. But also taking a nose swab and taking vitals, like 15 minutes after potential exposure, made little sense to me as a non-scientist.
Well, I don't know about that.
They might have been trying to rule out chemical, because I think the commander, I forgot her name, at one point she says, well, it wasn't sarin or VX or a chemical weapon because we'd all be dead. We'd all be dead. Like she had really good deduction in figuring out that it was biological.
They mentioned a specific chemical agent that's escaping me right now as one. The
mustard,
the doctor mentioned it wouldn't be mustard because Mary McCormick's character specifically says you would have smelled it.
Oh, right.
You smelled it. No, the doctor that's treating President Bartlett mentions mentions a potential chemical threat, and of course it's escaping me right now because Butterfield mentioned that they had detected traces of something, or they detected traces of something. So they kind of mentioned the potential for a chemical threat, and so the doctor responds to that with his personal medical knowledge and says, all right, well, we need to get you all in the showers right now just in case this is in fact a chemical threat. And it's not until after they shower that they do get confirmation that it was in fact tularemia.
Right.
So but again, that conflation of is it chemical, is it biological? I guess I could see taking vitals if you thought it was a chemical.
Yeah.
But they were doing that even before they knew whether it was chemical or biological, and maybe that's part of the SOP.
I think it's a fair thing to stick in an SOP. Especially if you don't know what it is.
But a nose swab?
Well,
I don't know what they're
it's
gonna
not a
what they're gonna
clinical
test
treatment and
for
what they're going
on
to do
the
with it,
nose
but they're
swab.
getting clinical specimens.
Yeah.
But what I thought was interesting was, okay, if you're going to just say automatically we're going to gather clinical specimens, you would not just do
No,
a
you
nose
do blood.
swab.
Yeah.
Right, you got these people, you got the
Yeah.
White House
Yeah.
physicians sitting
Yeah.
there and presumably other staff.
Yeah. And let's assume you have an on-site lab that you can test all these things out.
Regardless,
Yeah.
you're going to do the nasal swab. Go ahead and draw some blood.
Throat
You can get
swab.
some, sputum.
Yeah. Urine.
Whatever else you might want to have. And now, of course, do we want to show all of that in a 45 to 60 minute television
Yeah.
show?
Yeah.
Maybe not. But it speaks to response protocols and whether we have that or not. My
Yeah.
answer to that is not, even now. But I didn't have a problem with that. I was like, okay. I mean, it may not,
Yeah,
is
might
it
not.
usul or not?
Yeah.
Who
But
knows?
I think even, I guess from my perspective, once you know that it's tularemia, and as we know at the end of this episode, even though they're telling everyone it was a false alarm, they know it was in fact tularemia. You are monitoring the president and that staff for the next week, right? To see if any change happens in their health as a result of infection.
Well, so this is really an interesting question, and it's something that Senator Daschle feels very strongly about. We have a recommendation in the old blueprint of 2015 that we produced and the new National Blueprint for Biodefense that we produced in May of this year that talks about the need for prospective studies. And we understand that, and it should happen. And for our listening audience, it did not happen for those that were exposed to anthrax on Capitol Hill, at least in 2001, which we all think is kind of ridiculous. However, if you start the way the White House physician does in this episode by saying, "Hi, I'm just going to go ahead and give you Cipro," I don't know what would you be monitoring for?
Yeah.
Over the long term.
Yeah, because you would have initial exposure. You're going to cover that exposure by taking an antibiotic. In this case, that would be effective. And then, of course, he's telling them, I'm sure, stay on the antibiotic for however long you're supposed to stay on it.
Was it 100 days? Is that what he said?
Is that
So
what
it
he
was a
said?
period of time.
It was a long
Yeah,
period
that
of time, I
seems
think. Yeah.
excessive,
Yeah.
but however long it is.
Yeah.
So what would you be monitoring? You'd be monitoring
For a viral
compliance with bacterial, antibiotics.
Well, and you'd be
And-
monitoring for viral infection potentially, right? I guess if it hadn't been tularemia in this case.
Yeah. Well, either way, bacterial or
some kind of
viral.
long-term effects, like.
But it would have to be It would have to break through, is what I'm saying. You would not pick up on
Yeah.
viral or bacterial load in a person 50 days later if they've been on antibiotics for 50 days. Right?
Unless it's antibiotic resistant.
Unless it's antibiotic resistant. But then 50 days later, you would be dead.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So,
You'd be-
so I think within a few weeks. But regardless, there should be some
Long-term.
prospective studying.
Yeah. Well, because even think about long COVID, people who had asymptomatic cases ended up getting long COVID, and that's a
Yeah.
that's
Well,
a
and
truth
what if
with a
it's
lot of
genetically
viral
modified?
bacterials. Exactly. Yeah. You don't
You
know
know,
if it's
maybe
genetically
there's some other
modified.
impact that
Right.
it would have that wouldn't be treatable with an antibiotic. It would just happen,
Right.
right? Affect the person. Then you come in with the antibiotic. It kills the organism. And
But
by
there's still
then-
the long-term impact.
Yeah.
The long-term impact. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gotten as far as what? Where are we, JT, in the
So I've just been.
timeline?
So in the timeline, so we have.
We've gotten to quarantine.
Yes. Let's talk about the quarantine
Okay.
a little bit more.
Yeah, sorry, I've been jumping around a bit.
No, yeah, I'm jumping around too.
I didn't notice if we had a process we were supposed to go through.
Okay.
Oh, no.
There's no process.
There's no process. It's
So
just this is just background info.
okay, I gotcha.
Okay.
So,
we have
the
quarantine.
the quarantine and isolation.
Uh-huh.
I think, like, when I was first watching the episode, I thought the woman who was having allergies was exposed to something, I would have isolated her the minute like once they knew that there was a threat. I would have isolated her immediately.
Yeah, but why would you isolate her from the other people that she was already with?
Because you can always have an additional viral load or a bacterial load. So if she was like around somebody for maybe 5 minutes, that's less of a threat than them, her being around them for half an hour. And she was exhibiting symptoms, even though they were just allergies.
Yeah, but okay. But
and then she said she got sprayed in the face by perfume.
But think about this, though. She was in a vehicle with the president and somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? It was the three. So they were driving from somewhere. This is Washington, D.C. They did not take a limo from right next door over to the White House, right? So they were probably in that limousine for 15 minutes with her sneezing and stuff. Remember, the president was handing her the Kleenex and stuff.
And I guess realistically, the incubation period would not have been that quick.
Exactly.
So they probably could have ruled out.
Well, all I'm saying is, in terms of isolation, I would not have isolated her from Bartlett and whoever else was in that limo with her. By then, it's too late. They've been sitting around each other all this time.
Yeah.
They should be, and they were isolated together.
Well, I think this points to a good question that I think anyone who's responding to a situation like this needs to ask. What are the potential pathways of infection and and what is the origin of the threat, right? Because her sneezing and the talk about the perfume in her face is all a red herring for the actual threat that was identified later on in the episode. So if you're the Secret Service responding to this situation, you hear these stories, you have to take everything seriously, I assume, until you can rule them out. But in that moment, when they have the anomalous detection, it's not necessarily because they don't know about the story of her being in the limo with the president.
Yeah.
All they know is that these people are in close quarters in this area that had a normal biological detection. Seal it all, and put them all to the side and quarantine them. I think that makes a lot of sense if I were in that position.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you can start taking stories and ruling out potential pathways and origins of infection.
Yeah, I think the isolation was done pretty well though. Overall, they had to put on masks.
Yeah.
Stay in their separate rooms.
Can we talk about that though? Surgical masks in the White House? No N95s for the president?
Well,
It was 2004.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, were N95s not around in 2004?
I mean, they probably were, but
I don't know.
I would guess.
We had such a mass panic 4 years ago in this country when it came to COVID-19 with average people like me, and you trying to get our hands on N95s. You're telling me that the White House doesn't have a stockpile of N95s for a potential biological event? I was struck by that.
Maybe
seeing
that's
that
a
woman come out in a surgical mask.
If they don't have a stockpile.
And frankly, full-blown PPE for that matter.
Yeah.
Well, there is an implication throughout this show that there is a stockpile somewhere. I mean, even with the surgical masks, they got a bunch of surgical masks, not just for the White House physician and like one person walking in.
Right.
They had surgical masks. He has access to Cipro and presumably a variety of other antibiotics or something that he could just give to them, at least to start them on their run of antibiotics. They had things for them to change into. They just seem to have a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
He does.
Maybe the White House pharmacy has a stockpile.
There's a White House pharmacy?
I think there is, right?
I have to imagine they would have something like that.
I thought there had to be one. I don't know. Maybe I'm making it up.
Where does the president fill his prescriptions?
Well, I think you go to the White House physician, but I don't think there's like a separate pharmacy.
I mean,
you walk up to.
Capitol Hill doesn't have a pharmacy. They have a health clinic that people can go to. But we're also plebs who are expected to go get our own medicine. For the president, though, he's not going out to CVS. There's a question of who's filling his prescriptions and where the physician is getting the medication to treat the president. I think
and his
there's
immediate family as well.
And frankly, in a larger perspective, we're not talking about the series as a whole. Knowing that Bartlett has MS throughout his presidency, and he's getting daily treatments for it. Where is that medication coming from, and what is the chain of custody there that allows him to hide his health condition for so long?
Here's the thing: regardless whether there's a White House pharmacy separate or together with the White House physician's office, and this sort of med bay that he had in this episode, it supports the notion of forward deployment of a stockpile to various places. To big institutions or big important institutions like the White House. Personally, I think we should be stockpiling some stuff over on Capitol Hill for the staff and for the members that get exposed, especially after Senator Daschle and Senator Leahy received anthrax letters and stuff went all over the place. There was a precipitating event. After that, we should have at least learned that, and maybe we have. Maybe there's stuff there now. I don't know. But we make a recommendation about that too, about the need to forward deploy our strategic or parts of the strategic national stockpile beyond the 7 caches we have in this country. And the states are leaning forward on this too.
After the mishap with COVID.
Yeah, with COVID. Well, and President Trump coming out and saying, "Hey, you guys are on your own. You buy it for yourselves." But I think what we have now is this very uneven, like some states have stuff and some states don't. And some states have certain things and others have other things. Some are still depending on the CDC to send what's ever in the stockpile to them if there's an outbreak of some sort. Others are not. I don't think it's been worked out particularly well.
Yeah, there's a lot more work that needs to be done on that particular topic.
Yeah, with the stockpile.
But it does show, this show reveals to us that if you have it, it's nice because right away you can start taking some action.
Yeah, you can take the Cipro and start working on addressing the potential threat.
Yeah. I think the prophylactic Cipro was a good idea. You should just do it if you know that there's something, because it's not going to harm you.
Yeah.
To take Cipro.
Yeah.
So I think that was good. Kind of going back into a little bit with kind of just like the policy and like the way things kind of unfolded. One thing I noticed from Senator Daschle's podcast with the West Wing Weekly was he said like one of the criticisms was that transparency was missing within the White House as to what was going on, the reality of the threat, even if it was a drill. There was not very much communication going on between White House staff, the president. And I feel like that, I agree with Senator Daschle. I don't think that's realistic. I think the president, even if he was part of a no-knock drill, so to speak, would at least be given fake materials or something, something to describe what's happening.
I think
Who are you saying
the president?
But the president was kept informed in this.
He was informed of it?
He was.
He
was the only one.
He was the only one that really, although there was some other information that was going out to the group that they had been isolated with him just because they were sitting there and they had to say something to them. But I think Senator Daschle was talking about lack of transparency to everybody inside the White House, because everybody's sitting there, everybody's waiting around, everybody's wondering what if they didn't have such a good control on the air handling system and somebody else got something. What's the explanation for, hey, we need to make sure that you're not you don't have symptoms of tularemia or whatever it is that they choose to say. I think there should have been that, but are you saying there should have been additional transparency to the American public?
Not to the American public necessarily.
I think there should have been.
I mean, obviously, ideally, we would like that, but I don't know if they could have fit it in an hour-long episode.
Well, but aren't we just, look, Toby and Will are sitting around, the communications people who just draft up a press release about it.
When I was watching it, I thought, in the initial minutes of response, although since the entire response was only 43
15 minutes.
Yeah, 8 minutes to lock down, 43 minutes to adjudicate. when you aren't entirely sure what you're dealing with, I think a lack of communication is acceptable for a certain period of time, other than to tell people that there's been, something that they found something that warrants a lockdown. We'll try to get back to you with more information as soon as we have a better understanding, but we don't want to cause panic.
Right.
So, but once you have an understanding that it's tularemia, it is kind of incumbent on you to either inform, or if it's an exercise, to inform people that it was a no-knock exercise after the fact.
Right.
A no-knock exercise is only valuable to keep people in the dark until the event has actually happened and the response has been undertaken. Right. There's no reason to leave people in the dark after the fact. But that's there's also this confusion about keeping it secret that it wasn't actually a drill, that it was in fact a real attack.
I was very confused about that.
Yeah, I thought it was not an exercise. I thought
it was not an exercise. So they lie to the aides at the end and tell them it was an exercise. Gotcha. And then after they go home, Bartlett turns to Butterfield, the Secret Service stand-in, as it were, and then they talk about the fact that it was in fact real. In fact, had been anticipating an attack
because the FBI
by this rogue chemist. By the way, they use the word chemist,
which is hilarious.
Again, conflation of chemical and biological, and that Butterfield says we won't let it happen again. And
well, how is he gonna? But that doesn't even make any sense, right? Because they did not send a letter to the White House. They sent that letter to Charlie at his apartment somewhere. The Secret Service isn't going to be able to do anything about that.
That's what the story. That's the story that was given, but they never confirm at the end if that actually was the threat avenue, right? Mm-hmm. That they said that to Charlie, and they said that to
they don't
the other aide, but since we know at this point that they're not telling the entire truth to those two, for all we know. It could have been that way. Could have been that pathway. This chemist, for some reason, thought that if I send a letter to the home of the president's aide, somehow he'll bring it into the White House. Or it could have come in through some other avenue.
Or it could just be that Charlie was targeted.
Or Charlie was
just
targeted.
Happened to bring the mail
as folks who've watched this show know, Charlie is targeted repeatedly throughout the series, both in terms of threats and actual acts, as a result of his relationship with the president's daughter.
I will say, though, the Secret Service could say nobody's allowed to bring any mail in from outside. That's a fair thing
to be honest.
That has to be a protocol.
To be honest, it was it's somewhat shocking. I guess it's not shocking. On Capitol Hill, when you send mail to the Capitol building or to surrounding House and Senate buildings, there's an off-site screening facility in Maryland where they essentially cook all the mail before it is then delivered, in recognition of what happened to Senator Daschle and other folks back in 2001 during the Amerithrax attacks. But if I were to just bring in personal mail from home, that's going through an X-ray machine, in the Cannon office building or the Dirksen Senate office building, and nobody is taking it to an off-site location to scan it. So it's largely left to the judgment of individual staff and visitors when you're walking things in.
But they could have said.
They could have said.
The Capitol Police could have said, after the anthrax letters came about.
You're right.
They could have said, hey, at least to the congressional staff, you're not allowed to bring in any mail. And everybody would have said, okay, we're not going to bring in any mail. Yeah. So, but regardless, at least in this case, I take back what I was saying. The Secret Service wouldn't be able to do anything. They could have at least said that.
If in fact that was the method by which this rogue chemist attempted to put tularemia inside the White House. But it was confusing to me a little bit, and perhaps this is a 2024 mentality looking at a situation from 2004 about the lack of transparency and the fact that there was an attack committed on the White House. I mean, we see every time letters are mailed with ricin to the president, to sitting members of Congress, to anthrax mailed to Senator Daschle. Whenever there's anything like that, there's a lot of transparency about the fact that an attack has taken place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so it really felt weird to me watching this that not only are they not being transparent to the White House staff, or to the American people, but they're not even being transparent to the White House staff or the two people who were actually exposed to tularemia alongside the president at the very end of it. It was a very odd narrative decision.
Yeah. Well, But it was more dramatic, I suppose.
Well, of course it was.
You know,
There's
now
that.
we have this,
It's a
this
double
question mark hanging over everybody.
It's it's a very clever double twist, right? You have the initial twist of, oh, it was actually a exercise all along, and then the final twist of actually it wasn't. And there was this story presented to these people, ostensibly to make them feel more secure and safe about coming back to work, and to feel, I assume, to make Charlie feel less guilty about the fact that he brought the biological threat into the White House.
Right.
But the fact that none of it ever goes outside the knowledge loop of the president, the Secret Service, and presumably the chief of staff is very odd.
Yeah.
Do you think you would want to give or let people know?
Yeah, I mean, unless you're essentially trying to prevent embarrassment to the Secret Service, which I would not recommend. I don't think that's you could justify doing.
I think whoever wrote the episode just made a choice, and they just went with it. We know from other events that have occurred, especially with ricin letters, that the White House has historically had no problem saying, "Hi, this happened." Yeah. Somebody tried to send a ricin letter to President Obama, whatever, and sadly, we all kind of go, "Well, that's terrible," and continue along.
But par for the course at this point. And again, I think it could be just a relic of the time that this episode came out, that wasn't a norm. In 2004, the way that it is today.
I think we would advocate, the commission would advocate for transparency,
Absolutely.
having a communications plan, in advance. It doesn't have to be a big deal. They don't have to have a big press conference if they don't want to, but
something
to say that it happened, because I can see both sides of this. On the one hand, maybe you don't want to alert, you
don't want copycats.
Or even the person who did it as to the success of their effort. On the other hand, it doesn't engender much in the way of White House staff trust and public trust. And also, if you say something, you can also be sending the message that, hey,
we stopped it.
Like
the ricin letters.
Don't try and do this again because we're on top of it.
Yeah.
And nobody died. And knock it off, or even here we are, and now we're coming after whoever it is that did this. The Department of Justice has been engaged. We are investigating, etc.
Yeah, I think that there's also value here from the perspective of a presidency and an administration that would want to emphasize that this is a serious threat that can reach even the heights of the White House, and therefore we need to take it seriously. I think it could be frankly, a communications boon to any president, to a president that's concerned with national security and with biodefense in particular.
Yeah.
And not to mention safeguarding their own person against these sorts of threats. But while we're talking about this rogue chemist, I did think it was interesting at the end that the writers made a point of having Butterfield talk about. I think it was Butterfield and Bartlett talk about how the world of threat actors has expanded with science. I think Bartlett in particular says, it used to be a terrorist abroad seeking to do damage to us. Now it's somebody with,
a chemistry.
With a
high school
chemistry background.
Yeah.
Again, the conflation of chem. But it did, as I heard that point, it obviously reminds of all, again, this was a statement that was made in 2004 before CRISPR really became a thing.
Yeah.
And, we've had lots of conversations in the intervening years about how it's never been easier to develop a biological weapon.
Right.
And reminded me, frankly, in that moment of the recommendations that we've issued in our Apollo and Athena reports and have carried over into our 2024 National Blueprint for Biodefense, talking about DNA synthesis and obtaining genetic material for use in research, and wanting to make sure we limit the ability of bad actors to get a hold of that material for this very reason. It's been much easier, certainly easier than it was even back in 2004 for people who wish harm upon a government to really enact these sorts of plots.
Well, there is one thing, among the many things that we take issue with in terms of this particular episode, but they talk about some evidence that they do find, and that is that the chemist, this rogue chemist, tried to order tularemia from the CDC. Mm-hmm. You cannot order biological agents from the CDC. You can,
as a lone individual.
You can order biological materials from the American Type Culture Collection, ATCC.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
However, tularemia, anthrax, botulism, brucellosis, and a whole bunch of other things are on a list of biological agents that we're very concerned about. And so therefore, even if you tried to order this stuff from the ATCC, you wouldn't have been able to do it.
Right.
Number one. And then number two, I think everybody, CDC, ATCC, whoever, would have been highly confused by a chemist ordering this stuff.
Right.
And you have to give a purpose. You can't, it's not like
You have to
going to Amazon and ordering tularemia.
Right.
You would have to have a reason for it, a research, project or something. And there wouldn't have been anything like that in this scenario.
Now, again, this is coming from a point of ignorance, but is there a way to create tularemia using other genetic material, or do you have to get tularemia specifically?
I'm not sure how easy it would be to do, but I think you could definitely just make it if you know
if you have the genetic code.
The genetic code, and today it would be, compared to 2004, it would be very, very easy to do without the regulations that we were talking about with DNA synthesis.
But I also don't think you have to do it that way. Tularemia is endemic in this country. It's not everywhere. It's not endemic like COVID is everywhere, but it is endemic in the United States. I think it's sort of in the middle part of the United States. It affects rabbits. It affects a whole bunch of animals, I think. And in theory, you could just go and get it.
Scoop it up.
You'd have to be patient.
Careful.
You'd have to find those sick animals. You'd have to, but you could get it that way. But then you'd have to culture it. You'd have to be able to grow it. And once again, a chemist, probably not the best background for trying to do that, but you could do it. It's around. You wouldn't have to go somewhere else. You don't have to go to Africa to go get the Ebola. You can
just get it
be right here. So I think you could grow it.
You
could. But you'd have to, the whole process. You'd have to get it. You'd have to isolate it. You'd have to culture it. You'd have to grow it. You'd have to have the equipment to do all of that. You'd have to not get infected yourself, which means you would have to have been vaccinated if there is a vaccine for tularemia, or have antibiotics for it. And then you have to grow enough of it to then weaponize it, because that's in this series or in this show, it was weaponized.
Was it aerosolized as well, or did they not?
It was dried and powdered.
I think it was implied to be aerosolized.
Yeah, so dried and powdered, that would be a very difficult.
Right. I mean, you could do it. You'd have to get desiccators and stuff. There is equipment that you can order. It's available. You don't have to pass any security.
I mean, since we know that BioWatch had a hit in 2012 out in, what was it, Colorado, tularemia, we know it happens naturally to a certain extent.
Yeah.
So
that could be on somebody's boot.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, but what I think is interesting, just as a side comment here, it is not that hard for Hollywood to contact science professionals and find out whether what they have written or what they want to do is accurate or not. But I will say, having been a person who's advised on some of this stuff, as a scientist, you can say, well, this is realistic and this is and this is and that is, and they can still decide to do some things because they think it would be more effective or entertaining. But in this case, I very much think that the writer could at least have said biologist instead of chemist. At least that.
Yeah, completely agree. And as I'm sure you probably heard, The West Wing did employ some folks with White House experience to help inform the show. And even with that knowledge and understanding, they still obviously took the show in certain directions that are not remotely realistic for narrative purposes, for entertainment purposes. And so it would not shock me had they consulted with somebody about this sort of topic and then decided to still take the story in a different way for, to up the stakes, to up the ante.
But okay, I'm with you on that, and that's true, and it is entertainment. But there's another thing I want to bring up that I had an issue with. That is the White House physician trying to answer questions about what tularemia is.
Oh,
and
he's like,
he
it's
has
plague.
that quote about it's like, in fact, it is plague.
And then
It is
cut
not.
to commercial.
It is not.
It's not. They're two different
Tularemia
things.
is not plague, and I defy anybody to tell me that a White House position, somebody that's gone through the military and has gotten all the way to that point, and has been chosen for their expertise and carriage, that person would confuse Francisella tularensis
With Yersinia pestis.
Yersinia pestis. I didn't have a problem with the first part. It's like plague. Even
That's
though
fine.
I would still say I'm not sure I would agree with that.
Yeah,
but
they're
you're
both
talking to a
bacteria.
bunch of civilians.
Yeah.
But to say it's
Okay.
literally plague is just factually incorrect. Yeah.
And
It doesn't even spread the same way. Tularemia doesn't spread person to person. Plague does. So it's completely different.
well, even if it did spread the same way, it's just not the
yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
It's not the same thing. I'm not having it. I don't think they should have said that. Although I get that they probably wanted the line to be, it is.
Yeah,
It is
it was,
plague.
it was clearly the intended cliffhanger
Yeah.
But
right
then
before the
why,
commercial
then the
break.
other question is, why didn't they just, if they were
Yersinia
so
pestis.
interested in plague, why didn't they just
Just
make
say
a
it's
whole
plague.
thing about plague?
Well, in 2004, how many plague cases were we really seeing nationwide relative to today? I feel like plague has kind of had a little bit of a resurgence, particularly out west in recent years.
Well, throughout the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah.
We had the plague out in Madagascar. I want to also do another fact check here. The Secret Service says during this episode that this disease is colorless and odorless, but that UV light shows it. I'm not.
Did
I
it
don't
say that it
think
shows it or that it kills
He
it?
says it shows it.
Wow.
And this cannot be correct. I'm telling our audience this is not correct. You cannot see bacteria or viruses with UV light. But I think maybe they were talking about maybe it was in a fluid or something that was containing the microorganisms, and
Yeah.
you could see that.
Mm-hmm.
But with UV or something else. But
Yeah, I find it. That's just not the way you would look at it. You would do mass spectrometry or some other kind of
I just
method.
believe that a TV show that employs former White House personnel as advisors to sort of check on, what's being said and how it's being said, or get ideas about how things might have happened or would be done, should similarly employ or reach out to somebody who can check stuff like this.
Absolutely.
It would not have taken that long.
This seems like very, very rudimentary sorts of fact checks, and the internet was a thing back then, so they could have taken 2 seconds to look this up.
So now I do have a question, though. One thing I thought was unrealistic is that when they finally kind of clean up or do whatever, the Secret Service is the one that says, well, hazmat, we don't know who's got the hazmat, but hazmat's come, and the Secret Service declares the area clear.
Yeah.
Clean, everything's fine. Now, we know from Capitol Hill what happened with the anthrax letters, that we basically had to force the EPA to go over there, and they had to clean up, and they didn't want to. They said it wasn't their responsibility, but then of course, it's Congress, so they had to. And it was the EPA who said, fine, all clear, everybody can go back to their offices.
And don't forget, they also had that entire building shut down for a number of months afterwards, to the point where they had offices sharing physical space with other offices.
Yeah. So what do we think about that? Could the Secret Service in this situation be able to...
Well, I mean, that's the real question, right? I mean, and this goes hand in hand with my remark earlier about how fast can a PCR test really be turned around for anything, for environmental sampling. It seemed very odd. I guess if it was a drill, that'd be one thing. But when you find out at the end of the episode that it was in fact a real attack, I'm highly suspect about the ability to adjudicate the scene, both in terms of infection in humans as well as environmental contaminant within a 43-minute period. That just seems very unlikely. And frankly, I think you're talking about keeping people in lockdown much longer. I think you're talking about even when they go home. I think you're talking about giving a lot more people Cipro, let's put it that way. And I think you're also monitoring their health for a period of time afterwards, like we talked about. But the actual area of the release, if you get confirmation that it was tularemia, the president's not walking through that corridor to the Oval Office again anytime soon, or at least not for the rest of the night. Even if you were to to speed EPA or any other agency up there to investigate.
Yeah, and I also don't think that the on-site Secret Service would have the expertise. Maybe the Secret Service has somebody that could have came in with expertise.
Or in this show, maybe they just turned the environmental health monitor back on and noticed that the particulates were now back to normal or something. I don't know.
I mean, there's also a question of would it ultimately be EPA? As we know, you mentioned EPA ended up having to do with the job back in 2001. But when we've seen accidental releases in more recent years, EPA has taken a back seat to CDC in many cases, like Tulane back in 2015 when there was an accidental release outside of a laboratory environment of a certain pathogen. The environmental sampling that took place around the perimeter of that laboratory was conducted, I believe, by CDC, not by the EPA, and they provided a secondary support.
But partly that was because the CDC and USDA are in charge of the select agent program, and it involved a select agent. That said, I believe tularemia is a select agent. So you're right. And interestingly, during the anthrax events of 2001, Senator Daschle said that it was somebody at NIH that decided what the antibiotic should be and how it should be distributed, not somebody down at CDC. Despite the fact that I know myself that CDC was leaning forward on dealing with the bioterrorist threat back all the way to 98, 99 at least. So it's interesting, and it does raise a good question that we still are struggling with here in the United States right now.
Yeah.
Who is in charge? Who are we calling? Who's going to decide? Is it Tony Fauci over at NIAID at the National Institutes of Health? Is it somebody at CDC? Is it CDC up here?
Yeah.
Is it the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response here in Washington, D.C. at the headquarters for the Department of Health and Human Services? Is it going to be somebody inside the Secret Service? I mean, nothing would prevent them from hiring somebody. Is it the White House physician or somebody on their staff? They could do it. And remember, the White House physician himself or herself is military. So now there's a whole question about, USAMRIID is just right up the street, at Fort Detrick. Is the military making a decision? And it's an attack on the commander-in-chief. So technically, it is a militaristic issue. I think that what I'm trying to say is, although it's not, the issue is raised in this show for a viewer like us. It's still not clear who would be in charge, who would be asked. Now, of course, we have additional offices now inside the White House that have knowledge about the biological threat. But is the head of the Office of Pandemic Preparedness and Response policy walking over and doing something, saying something? What about the people over in the National Security Council, or the people who sometimes are and sometimes are not supporting the Homeland Security Advisor? Who's going to decide?
Now, to give some credit where credit is due, the administration has updated the interagency operational plans to the biological incident annex of the National Response Framework, which is a lot of words to say that there is, in fact, a plan on paper somewhere that does assign some amount of responsibility to EPA for environmental decontamination when there is a biological event. But are those plans exercised? Are those plans socialized properly throughout the interagency beyond the people who wrote them? This was the same issue we had with the National Response Plan back in the day when you had Hurricane Katrina pop up and people had plans that were about half a foot high in terms of width that nobody had ever read before, and failed to properly execute. That's why we went to a framework approach to how we respond to national events, and so that's why one of our recommendations in the new 2024 blueprint is to exercise those interagency plans and make sure that all the agencies have an understanding of not just the degree of their responsibility, but how they'll work together to adjudicate something like environmental contamination in the event of a biological event occurrence.
So I do have a question. JT, you said that there are hints of an ongoing FBI investigation.
Yeah, so that was toward the end when they mentioned that
When they talk about the chemist.
the chemist.
And they have understanding and knowledge of what the chemist has been up to.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't entirely clear, and maybe you picked up on it more than I did, about whether or not that was based on the investigation of the FBI or some other law enforcement entity within the federal government, or if it was Secret Service investigation specifically. And that really points to the fact that I just don't have as much knowledge about the extent to which the Secret Service investigate threats, or if they're referring threat information to the FBI.
I don't know. I just think it's worth talking about a little bit. I think that certainly, ordinarily, the FBI would be put in charge of such an investigation.
Right.
It would not be state and local folks. It would not be anybody else. And other federal departments and agencies, or federal law enforcement folks in those departments and agencies, do hand off to the FBI or work with the FBI. But in this case, there's a question, and we don't really have a satisfactory answer. If this is considered an attack on the president, then it is the Secret Service that's in charge of this investigation with the FBI's assistance. Now, the FBI may go off and be doing its own thing, but it's the Secret Service that's going to make a decision about it, and it's going to be in charge of that investigation.
Are you sure?
I am sure.
With what happened recently with Trump assassination attempt? Is that the FBI leading that investigation?
The FBI is leading the investigation of the sequencing of events that went down in the lead up to that event, but there's no longer an active threat to the president.
I see.
Right. So that's done.
So that's done.
That was a crime scene investigation and
That makes sense.
piecing together of events that led up to that moment, because that from my perspective at least, didn't just involve Secret Service personnel, but also state and local law enforcement as well.
Gotcha.
So it's a crime scene, and that's FBI jurisdiction.
So in this case, though, what do we think?
Yeah.
Was the president being targeted, or was it just Charlie? Would the Secret Service stay in charge of the investigation or not stay in charge of the investigation? Would they hand it off to the FBI?
Well, and does Secret Service jurisdiction extend to White House staff as well, and not just the president? There's a question.
Yeah, I mean, I would think that since the White House staff is in proximity of the president, maybe, I don't know. And the Secret Service also, I mean, as much as we love them, do not have jurisdiction over absolutely everything. Their jurisdiction is not as broad as the FBI's. But also, there's a question of resources. Who are they, putting on this investigation, and for how long? I don't know. I just thought it was, it's an interesting question. But the fact that, regardless, the FBI, I believe, certainly would be involved to some extent. And this brings us to one of our favorite questions about attribution, and several recommendations that we have on the need for biological attribution. This is a good example of a terrorist situation. I am not satisfied. If I was in that White House, in the Bartlett White House, and it ended the way it did, I would be screaming about it. Who is responsible for this? What are we going to do about it, and how are we going to find out? I mean, we have a letter, so now we're assuming terrorism, not naturally occurring tularemia in the Washington metropolitan area. But, we believe at the commission that the FBI needs to be fully and completely in charge of the National Bioforensics Analysis Center, which is this thing that's sitting inside a DHS facility that's like half the responsibility of the FBI and half of the responsibility of the Department of Homeland Security, but really it's the FBI that's in charge, but we still have this financial issue. It's just really weird, and it should be just entirely, I believe, including the money given to the FBI. But this question of attribution and the attribution response apparatus, we make a recommendation about that. We need a national apparatus for this. If we're to believe this scenario, that a letter came to Charlie, or if at least that's the possibility of something in this, then now you have the entire U.S. Postal Service system that's involved. This is a national issue. If they didn't pick up on tularemia right away and people started to get sick, they'd be going to, their primary care physicians. They'd be going to hospitals, again, in the Washington metropolitan area. But now you have state folks, local folks, the district folks. We've got various labs going on. Eventually, the CDC would get involved because the specimens would be moving through the laboratory response network. It's not organized well enough, I don't think, in this country. And it needs to be. We have questions. And I think maybe this is realistic that they would end it like on a, we won't let it happen again somehow.
Yeah.
And the FBI is doing its thing and it's investigating ... It's not good enough.
Yeah.
Especially not.
Yeah.
No offense to myself and our fellow citizens, but this is the president of the United States.
Yeah, you want to know.
We cannot be satisfied with, that eventually someday in season 8, the FBI will come back and say, hey, this is what we found out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Not good enough.
Absolutely.
Does that happen later on in the series that we figure out who it was? Or?
No. It's you never hear of this person again. The chemist, presumably, I don't know, escaped or was killed they attempted to apprehend him. I assume. I like to imagine that with a lot of things. I do want to just mention one other thing before we move on, just generally about the show. What I've enjoyed so much about The West Wing in my repeated rewatchings of it over the years is their ability to rapidly distill very complex subject matter into very digestible formats for people who are not in the know. Mm-hmm. While we obviously had no issue kind of picking apart the inaccuracies where we saw them on this topic, I still had to give credit where credit was due that they successfully, at least from my perspective, really kind of gave a snapshot of this sort of topic, but really back in 2004 when most people's understanding of it was really the anthrax attacks, and even then it was kind of abstract, I think, for a lot of people who weren't directly impacted. And to do so in an episode that was clearly intended to be a bottle episode. And what I mean by that is an episode where they force, through convenience, all the main characters into a singular space and force them to confront each other about things or to pair off and talk about different issues. And they're not really going to different locales or scenes. Sometimes shows do this for narrative purposes, other times it's for budgetary reasons. And the idea that they were able to create a bottle episode using a biological thread, and they chose to do so using a biological thread, I thought was pretty clever. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate the fact that they decided to take a look at this important issue.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the way that they designed the episode around that, and I know we didn't talk too much about the character interactions, but I thought that even not having seen most of the show, that was an interesting way to go about it.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, too. Although I will say, I don't know why the Deputy National Security Advisor would be alerted singularly over, Josh Lyman's character, for example.
Yeah,
it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, a Deputy National Security Advisor would be before a Deputy Chief of Staff seemed a little odd to me.
Yeah. But...
yeah.
I mean, obviously, they were trying to introduce something into their interaction, their conversation.
I mean, it really, if you take a look at those other scenes, and obviously this doesn't have much to do with bio, but, you have an introduction of a new character and her first interplay with one of the main characters. You have another scene where two characters, CJ and Donna, get a chance to bond a little bit about and kind of share their own concerns about their lives with each other. And then you have a third situation between Will and Toby that really is a blow-off between the two of them that has been percolating for a while. The issues that Toby has with Will having gone to move to work for the vice president, and Will in turn kind of sharing with Toby how he really views him. A lot of character development in different real settings and situations, all in the course of 40 minutes, which I've always appreciated with this show. Both during the Sorkin era and after we left.
Yeah. Okay, great. Do you guys want to get to the ratings?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right. So the first category is relevance to the commission recommendations.
I should ask, 5 is most,
best.
1 is least?
Yes.
Okay.
5 is best.
Okay.
1 is, or if you think it's really bad, you can give it a 0.
Nice.
So yeah, what we kind of do is we'll just discuss between ourselves what we think the score should be.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I thought it should be like just the relevance to saving Sisyphus and the prescience that this episode had. I think I have to give it a high mark. Like I was thinking 5 potentially.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've mentioned at least half a dozen different commission recommendations
Yeah.
over the course of this discussion, probably more than that if I really wanted to add them all up. And the fact that at the end of the day, this all started with a environmental detection of a biological threat, I mean, points very much to something that's been at the core of what our work has been over these last 10 years. So I would agree. I'd say 5.
Yeah. Let's give it a 5.
Okay, sounds good. Next category is scientific accuracy. I put it at a 3.
I think I'm kind of feeling a 3 to be generous because there are pieces of it that I think are accurate.
Yeah.
I think in terms of the way that they approached the threat once the threat was identified was accurate. The timing was completely inaccurate. And some of the tech involved with identifying the threat, I think, was also inaccurate. And obviously the tularemia as plague, definitely inaccurate.
And the chemist.
And the chemist, and the conflation of chem and bio, which is a long-standing issue that I'm sure you all will be discussing for other movies on this podcast as you move forward.
Okay. We're giving it a 3.
Are you thinking 2?
I think it should go down to a 2.
Okay.
Just on the basis of it, I don't see any medical doctor conflating 2 diseases like that.
But you would see them prescribing Cipro, though, right?
He prescribes Cipro because of the assumption, he assumes that it's anthrax. And so I thought that was okay. Then later, he prescribes an antibiotic cocktail, which I don't know. I don't know that that's so...
Yeah.
Why?
It's kind of obscure.
You know, it seemed, and it would only be effective if it happened to contain antibiotics that would be effective against tularemia. And if not, then he would be moving to yet another antibiotic. So, I don't know. You think I'm being too harsh with a 2?
I mean, I could go with a 2. It's honestly, it kind of sounded like you were agreeing with a lot of what they were putting out there with some of the scientific pieces.
Yeah. Okay, we'll give it a 3. Let's give it a 3. Okay?
Sounds good.
Scenario development?
Yeah, so for scenario development, I thought it was a decently developed scenario. I think the twist of it being a drill and it not being a drill was pretty cool. I think the scenario was developed well, as much as you can in an hour-long episode.
I would agree that if you're going to try to portray a biological attack on the White House, this is a good way to do it.
I would give it a 4.5. Deducting points for
Half a
the
point.
lack of some, the accuracy there.
Okay.
That's what I think.
Is that what you think too?
I had given it a 3.
Okay.
But after we talked about it more, I was thinking, I don't know.
I think it's pretty realistic.
I think it's pretty realistic, yeah.
I didn't know you guys had half points in this rating system.
Oh, of course.
Is this the first time you've done it, or have you done it for other?
We have.
We've done it for others.
Yeah.
Entertainment value?
I give it a 5.
I like it.
Yeah.
A 5.
Yeah, 5.
I
was entertaining enough, me having not seen.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the West Wing, so obviously it was a 5 for me.
Success of the imagination or creativity. And success of the imagination is meant to be the opposite of failure of the imagination.
So in terms of the story that they're telling?
Yeah, and how they presented the threat. I think I would give this either a 3 or a 4. I don't think tularemia is that imaginative, but, this is with 20 years of context after.
Yeah, but at least they used tularemia and not anthrax. That would have been like, just copying something else.
I think, and then the fact that they made passing reference to anthrax, I think, was also a good idea to make it established. Like, we know anthrax is a threat. Yeah. We deal with that, but here's something else. I agree. I think they were trying to be realistic to a certain extent.
Yeah, they were trying to be realistic.
And realistic about what sort of threat would come down. Although, of course, then they call tularemia plague, so there's that piece. But I would say 3.
What do you think, Asha?
I think they should get points for even thinking about it. I would have given it a higher score.
Oh, okay.
I would have given it a 4. But I do take your point. It's not particularly imaginative.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nice that they did a show on it. I agree.
And that it was realistic.
And that it was realistic, but there was no real interesting twist.
Yeah.
Except
there
for
was
the
no-
twist of it wasn't actually a false alarm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Want to give it a 3?
Yeah, let's give it a 3.
Okay.
Or what were you thinking?
I had originally given it a 4,
I give it a 3.5 if we're doing
maybe
half points.
3.5.
Okay.
Shock or surprise value. Now, I had initially given this a low mark just because I was confused by the ending.
I would give it a high mark only because I was shocked that they didn't tell people it wasn't a false alarm, and I was shocked at how quickly they adjudicated. I was surprised by how quickly they
Well,
fixed
I think
everything.
the only thing that was shocking, or like, emotionally shocking, was that somebody sent this to Charlie.
Okay.
That's all.
As someone who's watched the rest of the series, I wasn't actually shocked by that because, again, he's been kind of targeted throughout the series with threats and at least 1 or 2 occasions, I think, actual attempt of some sort. Shock, surprise value.
I don't know. I mean, look,
Yeah.
2 or 3 years prior, Capitol Hill received a letter. Now, in this show, somebody said, "Hey, let's send a letter to the White House."
Yeah,
That's not so.
yeah. I'm probably
Shocking and
towards like a
surprising.
2 or a 3 at most.
Yeah, I'm saying I'd give it a 2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think 2.
Maybe we're just jaded biodefense
I know.
folks at this point. This is all usual for us.
Okay. And so the next category is government policy. I think I gave this a pretty high mark. I think I gave it a 4 just because I think they represented government policy well.
Yeah.
Most of the the titles and names made sense
Yeah.
of all the people.
Yeah,
Involved.
I think ordinarily I would have given it a 5, except that the Secret Service declaring an all clear versus
Yeah.
CPA or somebody didn't make sense.
And then the speed with which I don't know, I still get hung up on the fact that they locked down over anomalous particle detection essentially in the air. It just kind of.
I don't think that that's accurate.
Yeah.
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 But would it be good government policy if it was accurate?
I don't know. That just seems incredibly disruptive. If you, again, maybe it works in the White House, but if you extrapolate it out to any other federal building
that's true. That's true.
or to any business, I mean, it's every day.
I think
Yeah.
we give it a 4.
Yeah.
Okay. 4 sounds good. Next category is portrayal by the actors. Normally when we're talking about this one, we're trying to determine whether or not the scientists were convincing,
I thought everybody was convincing.
but also other people. I think they all
even Reed Diamond as the
Yeah.
as the White House physician, I thought was fine.
Yeah, and I think the plague thing was a consequence of writing, not his.
And I would also say too that this is midway through the series, so pretty much everybody was on their game. The president has been the president for a while. We have Mary McCormick coming in as the Deputy National Security Advisor, but other than that, everybody's kind of been in for a while. Lily Tomlin is a great actress, so
It's Lily Tomlin, it's Martin Sheen.
Yeah,
No
I mean,
notes. I have no
there's
notes.
I think a 5.
Yeah, I'm giving 5. Direction. How do we feel it was directed? The entire episode.
Well, again, as I noted at the beginning, I appreciated the fact that they took a step outside for a minute and showed perspective of the Secret Service. If I have any criticism about the episode from that perspective, is I wish they'd done that a little bit more, shown a little bit more behind the scenes of some of the decision making that informed Butterfield's status updates to the president, and kind of peeled back the curtain even more there. But I also appreciated the fact that the episode lived up to its reputation as a bottle episode and really tightly focused the narrative on these 4 different scenes throughout. Right, you have the president and his aides, the Deputy National Security Advisor and the Deputy Chief of Staff, the press secretary and the assistant to the Deputy Chief of Staff, and then the 2 communications officials. It was very tightly hewed, and it was entirely from their perspective, looking at what's going on, literally in some cases, out on the other side of the glass, of a response to a biological threat. And I thought it was good direction from that perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Okay.
So you
What are
want
we
to give
giving
it
it, a 5?
5?
Yeah.
Yep.
And the last category is production or production value.
I think we have to take a point off because this environmental monitoring system doesn't exist.
Yeah. I think point off for that.
Yeah. Well, and even if it does exist, the
It looks
Yeah,
like
it
a heart
just
monitor.
looks so bad.
Yeah.
It
So
looked like
bad.
it looked like
Yeah.
a heart monitor to me.
Yeah.
I was watching it muted, but even if I was fully expecting if I had the noise on, I was going to hear beep beep
Yeah.
beep beep.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we have to knock a point off for that.
And the tarp, there were some things
Yeah,
that
the
could have
tarp.
just done better.
Yeah. But otherwise, I mean, as usual, the West Wing's production value with representing the West Wing of the White House and the folks who
that
work
looks
there
good.
looked pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that there is definitely a high quality level overall throughout the show. So I would say it probably warrants a 3, 3.5, or even a 4, depending on how you all are feeling.
Yeah, I was thinking like 3.5. What about you, Asha?
3.5, 4. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so 3.5.
3.5.
3.5.
So the overall average score is 4.05, which I think is a pretty high mark.
Good.
Seems all right for the show and for this
Definitely.
episode in particular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so then in closing, I think this was a really great episode.
Yeah.
There are a lot of TV episodes that we look at that have like a teeny tiny piece that has to do with the biological threat, and then the rest of it just has to do with other things entirely. And I really liked how they wove it in between all the interpersonal relationship stuff and other things that were happening. I think actually that's very realistic that you would be, if we were all locked down,
Here. Yeah.
even here, we would say, okay, this is what's happening, and let's talk about what we have going on.
Yeah.
So I
Right.
thought that was great. But as we said at the beginning of today's Biollywood episode, we were talking about Rob, and that Rob has seen this show a billion times, the entire series. And there's something that I would like to give Rob the opportunity to say.
Oh, no.
President Bartlett
Mm-hmm.
has a phrase that is attributed to him that he says pretty much all the time. It didn't start out as a thing actually earlier on in the show, but they had him say it over and over and over and over and over again so much that now there are merchandise things and buttons and mugs and all kinds of things with this phrase. So Rob, I would like you to say what President Bartlett would say at this point.
I'll start by thanking our listeners and just leave it in the immortal words of Martin Sheen, President Bartlett, my personal president. What's next?
All right.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.